Something is wrong. Deeply, terribly wrong. The church you grew up with, the church you trusted to guard the truth, may have been guarding something else entirely. Not holiness, not revelation, but power. For centuries, names were protected, and questions silenced. You were taught to obey, but you were never told what obedience was really serving. And now, the silence has cracked. A quiet war has begun. But it's not between governments, not even between faiths. This war is within the Vatican itself. Pope Leo XIV has made his move. And it's not a whisper. It's a thunderclap that's echoing through every marble hallway of the Holy See. He has turned against one of the Church's most venerated guardians, the man who stood like a stone wall for tradition, the man who many believed could never be touched. Cardinal Burke has been cast aside. When loyalty becomes idolatry, the shepherd must choose the sheep over the sword. With those words, everything changed. Centuries of silent protocol shattered. But the question that haunts every corridor now, the question they dare not say aloud: why? What did Cardinal Burke really do? And what secret did Pope Leo XIV uncover that made him break the unbreakable? Is this a betrayal or a reckoning? You've entered the domain of Pope Leo XIV truth. And here, we don't run from the questions. We walk straight into them. Like this video, subscribe to stay awakened, and tell us where you're watching from. Because if you feel that something in the church isn't right, you're not alone anymore. You were told to trust them, to kneel, to obey, and never ask what lies behind the veil. For decades, you watched the incense rise and the gold shimmer, never imagining that beneath it all, something was rotting. But now you feel it, don't you? A shift, a fracture. Something in the church doesn't feel the same anymore. And you're not crazy for noticing. For years, one man stood like a statue in the storm, unshaken, unmoved. His voice echoed through the marble halls like thunder wrapped in Latin. He wore red, but it might as well have been armor. Cardinal Burke, former head of the Apostolic Signatura, the Church's highest court, and for many, the last defender of a dying order. Burke was no modernist, no reformer. He stood with the old ways, the Latin Mass, the rigid hierarchy, the belief that truth does not evolve with time. When the Church bowed to modern winds, Burke stood like a fortress, and many ran to him, not because he smiled, but because he never blinked. For years he was the wall, the place where the modern tide broke and fell back. But what happens when a wall starts to crack? Not from the outside, but from deep within? Pope Leo XIV didn't come to tear down the Church. He came to test the stones beneath her, to knock, not on the door of tradition, but on its foundation. And what he found shook everything. When loyalty becomes idolatry, the shepherd must choose the sheep over the sword. Cardinal Burke didn't fall. He was pushed, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. What did Leo see that the world wasn't supposed to know? What truth made him turn from the fortress and toward the storm? You're not just watching history. You're living in the middle of a confrontation that has been building for centuries, a war between preservation and purification. And tonight, you will see it unfold. They'll never say it publicly, not in the press briefings, not from the pulpit, and certainly not from the lips of cardinals wrapped in silk and silence. But you can feel it, can't you? Something broke. It didn't happen with a bang. It wasn't announced at a grand mass. No thunder, no lightning, no formal excommunication. Just a sudden absence. Cardinal Burke, gone from the advisory table, removed, silenced, reassigned with a signature and a stamp. No explanation, no apology. But the question isn't how it happened. It's why. Because behind the velvet curtains of the Vatican's power, a war of ideas had been raging, quietly, bitterly behind closed doors. On one side, Cardinal Burke, a man anchored in the doctrines of the past, who saw every change as a chisel hacking away at holy stone. And on the other, Pope Leo XIV, not a rebel, but a revealer, a man not trying to rewrite the gospel, but to unseal what had long been hidden beneath it. The church is not a place for novelty. It is the guardian of eternal truth. Strong words, and for many, comforting ones. But words that became sharpened blades when Pope Leo XIV began whispering a dangerous possibility. Truth cannot be caged in nostalgia, and holiness does not always wear old clothes. That struck a nerve, not because it was heresy, but because it pulled back the curtain. Pope Leo began reopening ancient questions about the first humans, about the nature of the priesthood, about whether tradition had stopped being a compass, and started becoming a mask. The two men clashed, not in public, but in principle. Pope Leo believed the church was suffocating under its own weight. Burke believed the only thing keeping the church alive was that weight. One wanted light to enter the sealed chambers. The other feared what would be lost if those chambers were opened. And then, it happened. Without ceremony, Cardinal Burke was removed from every theological advisory circle, quietly exiled from influence. The Vatican said nothing, but the silence said everything. And here's the part they hope you'll never ask. What did Burke say behind those locked doors that pushed Pope Leo to act? What did Pope Leo see? What warning, what hidden truth forced his hand against a man who once stood beside him? Was it doctrinal? Was it personal? Or was it something older, something buried, something the rest of the church isn't ready to confront? What if the battle wasn't about politics? What if it was never about power, or popularity, or press releases? What if this was about something much, much deeper? Truth. And what happens when truth collides with tradition? The Mass is not man-made. It is a sacred inheritance. It must not be tampered with, diluted, or deconstructed. That was Burke's heart. Not rebellion, not control, but preservation. To him, the old ways weren't just familiar, they were untouchable. The priest behind the veil, facing east, back to the people, because he stood before God. Burke saw any deviation as a betrayal, a crack in the dam holding back chaos. And to be fair, for many years, he was right. The church was drifting, confusion multiplied, reverence dimmed, and Burke shouted into that darkness, calling us back to the sacred. But then Pope Leo XIV arrived, and he didn't shout. He whispered something dangerous. What is sacred should not be forgotten, but neither should it be frozen. The Spirit of God is not entombed in Latin. With those words, the line was drawn, not between good and evil, but between memory and movement, between those who preserved the flame and those who dared to ask if the flame had become a prison. Leo believed that truth doesn't contradict tradition, but neither does it kneel to it blindly. He believed truth was bigger than vestments. That truth could be dressed in gold or in dust. That phrase, that was the earthquake. Leo saw that we'd mistaken the form for the substance. That many loved the rhythm of ritual more than the heartbeat of Christ. Burke, he saw that as surrender. When we tamper with what has been handed down, we tamper with the Holy Spirit himself. So who's right? Is truth something handed down like an antique heirloom, unchanging, unchallenged, sealed in time? Or is truth alive, moving, deepening, risking confrontation in order to reveal the face of God more clearly? That's the question Pope Leo XIV placed at the Church's feet. And in doing so, he crossed Burke's red line, and what followed wasn't just disagreement, it was collision. Cardinal Burke is no longer to serve in consultative matters. That was it. No heresy trial, no public anathema, just a quiet, clean removal. But its meaning was thunderous. Pope Leo wasn't attacking a man. He was attacking a mindset that said the Church's highest loyalty is to her memory, even if it blinds her to the present whisper of the Spirit. And that raises the question for you, brother, sister. Which would you rather serve? A church that remembers what was holy, or a church that dares to follow where the Holy Spirit leads, even if it means burning the map? Sometimes it's not an argument that changes everything. It's a moment, a vision, a whisper, a divine disruption. You've heard the theology, you've seen the debate. But what if I told you that none of this started with policy or doctrine? What if it started with a vision? They say he went alone. No cameras, no cardinals, just him, and the weight of questions that had haunted him since the night of his election. In the darkness of that ancient tomb, surrounded by centuries of silence, Pope Leo XIV knelt to pray, and what he saw, he never recorded in full. But those close to him, those who've seen the expression in his eyes since that night, say something changed in him forever. He saw two Adams, one crowned in uncreated light, radiant, royal, untouched by sin. The other, crawling from the dirt, clothed in shame, but chosen nonetheless. One forgotten, one remembered, one rejected by men, the other accepted by history. And in that moment, Pope Leo understood something terrifying. Adam was not the beginning. He was the restart. What came before him? He wouldn't say. But what came after that vision was a theological earthquake. He returned from that crypt and delivered a private teaching, never published, only whispered to a circle of trusted theologians. His words: Adam was not the first man, but the first priest. Not the origin of biology, but the origin of sacred vocation. Not the start of mankind, but the start of covenant. Do you understand what that means? It means there could have been others, people, beings, entire histories, before Eden, lost, buried, forgotten, or maybe erased. And now you see the problem, don't you? Because if what came before Adam was real, then what we've been calling the beginning was actually a second chapter. And that means the church has only been telling you half the story, not out of malice, but out of fear. Because to admit there was something before Adam is to admit we've built entire doctrines on an incomplete blueprint. Pope Leo XIV didn't come to destroy. He came to remember, to recover, to reopen what others sealed with sacred wax. And when Burke heard these whispers, he drew a line. To Burke, this wasn't mystical insight. It was theological trespassing. But for Pope Leo, it was revelation. A revelation that would not let him stay silent any longer. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But in whose beginning? And what came before it? Truth, when it finally knocks, doesn't always speak politely. Sometimes it breaks the door down. And when that vision entered the heart of Pope Leo XIV, the doors of tradition began to creak. What began in silence would end in confrontation. There's a moment in every story where silence becomes impossible, where the tension that's been buried under robes and rituals finally erupts. This was that moment. For months, the tension between Pope Leo XIV and Cardinal Burke had remained hidden. Their smiles in public, masks, the formal handshakes, empty rituals. But inside the Vatican, the air had changed. You could feel it. A chill beneath the marble. A silence too loud to ignore. It didn't happen with rage. It happened with resolve. No shouting, no ceremony, just a single sentence. Your service has been faithful, Eminence. But faithfulness must never become fossilization. And then, the letter was signed. In that moment, the unthinkable became real. Pope Leo XIV had turned, not out of hatred, not for vengeance, but for the church, for you. But in Burke's eyes, this was betrayal, not just of tradition, but of the church itself. To him, Leo wasn't just a pope trying to recover forgotten mysteries. He was a shepherd leading the flock into fog. And to Leo, Burke wasn't just a defender of orthodoxy. He was a man clutching the past so tightly he couldn't feel the present anymore. Two men, same altar, same Eucharist, and yet divided by something deeper than theology: vision. One man looked backward, seeking the sacred in memory. The other looked forward, trusting the Spirit in mystery. And that difference broke the Church's silence. Because this wasn't just Leo removing Burke, it was Leo sending a message to the entire Catholic world. Tradition is not your God. Truth is. Many were shocked, others were relieved, and a few began to wonder, what else has been hidden? If Leo could question Burke, could he question doctrines? Could he question councils? Could he question everything? And perhaps the scariest question of all, could he be right? You weren't supposed to see this side of the Church, the rupture, the betrayal, the painful purification, but you are now. Because truth doesn't hide behind red velvet curtains. It walks through fire, even if it burns everything we built. You've heard the clash, you've seen the rupture, and now you stand in the silence that follows a spiritual earthquake. What happens next? The world will speculate, the headlines will twist, but you know where to look. Not to newspapers, not even to church bulletins, but to the Word, and to the quiet place where the Spirit still whispers. This isn't just about Pope Leo XIV. It's not about Cardinal Burke. It's about you. Because for the first time in generations, you've been invited to ask the forbidden questions, to look beneath the polished surface, to touch the roots, to seek not just what's safe, but what's real. Pope Leo XIV is not calling you to rebellion. He's calling you to discernment, to conversion of mind and heart, to return, not to 1962, not to the Council of Trent, but to the garden, to the place before the divisions, before the councils, before the rites, to the first breath, the first priesthood, the first covenant, and in doing so, to rediscover what it really means to be Catholic, not in name, not in nostalgia, but in truth. Let us make man in our image, not my image, not your bishop's image, his image. And if we are made in his image, then it is not tradition that defines us. It is the truth that lives within us. So, what comes next? That depends on you. Will you return to the comfort of familiar rituals and sealed doctrines? Or will you walk, uncertain, uncomfortable, but faithful, into the mystery God is now unveiling? Will you cling to the sword? Or will you follow the shepherd? The age of quiet obedience has passed. The age of sacred questioning has begun. You were born for this moment, for this season, for this fire. Don't look away. Don't turn back. Don't be afraid. Because truth is not afraid of the dark. Truth enters it and speaks and saves. If this message stirred something in you, you're not alone. Like this video, share it, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. But above all, subscribe to this mission. Subscribe to Pope Leo XIV Truth, because truth is not popular, but it is eternal.